Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Startup Junkies podcast. Today we have the usual crew in the house. We have the man with the plan, Jeff Ryan. Say hi, Jeff.
Howdy, everybody. Glad
And
to be
we
back.
have the innovative director of marketing and events with Startup Junkie Foundation, Caleb Talley. Say hi, man.
Hello, hello.
And today we have a very special guest. His name is Omid Moghadam, and he is a serial entrepreneur, inventor, venture investor, and educator. He also specializes in launching new ventures with social impact in health and technology. I mean, wow, what a guy. Omid, glad to have you on. And to get things started, it would be great to hear about the journey you went on to get to where you are today.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I don't think there is a direct path. There's a point-to-point journey that anyone takes to entrepreneurship. I think there's a lot of falls and there's a lot of getting back ups, and there's a lot of things that you did not plan that you were going to do at the beginning of your career that you end up doing. And I mean, what has always animated me was technology, and initially early on in graduate school, I really just wanted to do research and teach. And through a series of events that I had no control over, I took a leave of absence from my PhD and got a job at the time, a Fortune 50 company, and was given a chance to do something completely new that no one had done before, and in the cardiology space, because I was studying computer science and electrical engineering, but mainly focusing on medical devices and medical imaging. And I was given a chance to actually develop a completely new line of business. And that bug bit me. And after that, academic research and looking for grants and publishing and all that sort of became secondary in importance to me. And that, the rush of creating, inventing something completely new and bringing it to market, and then seeing it used. And especially since it's in the medical industry, I mean, when I took my dad to the hospital at the time, he had heart issues, and I actually saw the device I made used on him. That was a very proud moment. So that's, I never looked back. I just moved forward from that point on, splitting my time, learning as much as I can about the business side of things. At that point, it was essentially technology, developing technology. And then I realized that there's a lot more. I mean, technology is only a small portion of what you were trying to do. Bringing something new to market takes a lot more other skills. So I started building those skills. And over time, large companies, at the time it was Eastman Kodak, then went into management consulting, landed at Intel, and it was mainly large company, what they call intrapreneurship. So it was essentially starting new businesses for larger companies based on new inventions. And then eventually I spun a company out of Intel, a healthcare IT company. Walmart became one of my largest customers and one of the first investors. And that sort of introduced me to the Northwest Arkansas. And after a couple of starts and stops in Silicon Valley and other things, I eventually, about 10 years ago, I landed here in Northwest Arkansas. Met people like Jeff Amorine and really enjoyed the entrepreneurial feel of the place, and felt that this is a place that we can start something new that's never been done before.
You met guys like me and you stayed anyway, is the real story.
That is the real story. And as soon as you give me those photos back, I might talk about moving.
Absolutely. Another off-the-record segment for the Startup Junkies podcast at some point in the future after my demise, I guess.
The uncut behind the scenes
exactly.
Feature. So, Amit, tell us a little bit about Namida Labs, your current venture. How did that come to be?
So Namida is really a continuation of some other venture that me and my current team here, we're working on for 5 years, a company called Ascendant Diagnostics. And Ascendant invented a new method of screening for breast cancer, looking for protein biomarkers found in human tears to screen for breast cancer. Ascendant was set up as a company to actually make a medical device. But that invention didn't seem to be able to take off in the medical device space. It was just not an easy thing to do. And right at the time that we were ready to look for investment to scale that company was around the time that Theranos's problems became evident. And all major investors lost interest in anything that had to do with med devices and in the diagnostic space. So Namida Lab is actually licensing the technology from Ascendant, but incorporating a different business model for it. And that's why we have built a CLIA laboratory to actually bring the test to market by performing it ourselves. And we are, before the pandemic hit, we were ready to validate the test. And with a deadline of July 1st to have it in market. Pandemic hit, all breast cancer screening stopped. So we couldn't even recruit patients into our clinical studies. So we switched to COVID testing. And we were one of the first laboratories in the country to have a validated antibody test for COVID-19. So that's the test that we're performing now. And now that the sort of like the first rush of antibody testing is sort of becoming more flat and more predictable, we're actually tooling to go back into our breast cancer screening. Now that the breast cancer screening centers are open again and we can recruit patients into our trials, we are tooling to start validating the test to hopefully bring it to market by the end of the year.
Is it for your COVID-19 testing? Is it a blood-based or is it a tier-based test as well?
It's blood-based.
It's blood-based. Okay.
Yeah, early on we ran some R&D projects to see what we can see of COVID in tiers, and there wasn't much. There wasn't much. I mean, there is no DNA in tiers. There was some microRNA, but not enough to be an inexpensive sort of fast test, which we were hoping to develop around that. But we're doing a blood-based antibody test right now.
And what's the target for a turnaround time? So once you get the sample, how quickly would they get results?
Oh, 24 to 48 hours.
Okay, so pretty quick. It's like a next day type of thing. That's great.
And who do you serve? Are you serving the hospitals with this diagnostics, or do people come to have those tests performed with y'all? Or
so we targeted large employers because large employers, as they're opening up their campuses, one piece of data that would be very useful to them is to know how the virus has migrated through their employee population that have been away for 3 months working from home. So they get a good picture of a historical picture, essentially, of the virus and infection in their employee population. And then they can marry that to PCR testing, which gives you a snapshot in time that who has the infection at that point in time. Then those two pieces of information can let them know how they can open up their offices. So that's the area that we have mainly focused on. But because our strength is in running thousands of tests a day. We have a high throughput laboratory, a completely automated laboratory. However, the phone was ringing off the hook when we announced that we have a test. So we're now offering it in retail channels as well. We have a partnership with the Heights Market in Little Rock. So they have a blood draw site on site in Heights in Little Rock. We have 2 locations here with Heartland Pharmacy and also Dixon Street Clinic. So they're all offering our test. If anyone's interested, www.namidalab.com. You can go and purchase a test there and go get your blood drawn at any of those locations.
Omid, as a follow-up to that, and again, this is topical, and it's topical for the day, is you have a more intimate view of what's happening with all this than maybe a lot of us because you're providing the testing.
Right.
One of the biggest things is this has kind of been dropped upon the world, and we're still really only 6 to 7 months into the whole experience. As you look at how the next 6 months to a year goes in general, if you were to have your crystal ball based on the knowledge you have and what you see from testing and just the overall CDC, WHO response, how's it going to look? I mean, what, as we're starting to trying to reopen, what's your, and I realize that it's hypothetical and it's maybe scientific wild ass guesses on your part, but you're so much closer to it than
Right.
the rest of us. I'd really be interested, and I think our listeners would be as well, on your take.
I don't know. I mean, I can't predict anything, but what I can say is that all decisions made up to this date and from this point on are being made with incomplete and sometimes horribly wrong data. And so all levels of government have performed less than 100%, that's for sure. I mean, I can give you a quick example. CDC in April of this year, they were begging laboratories like ours to develop antibody testing capabilities because they said, quote, it's a game changer for opening up the economy, that knowledge. Today, they're saying that, well, antibody testing is okay, but you really shouldn't make decisions opening up your campuses or getting kids back into universities based on antibody testing. So they have changed their tunes, but so that's from one side of the equation. On the testing side, on the other side of it, they say things like, however, we're paying billions of dollars to vaccine makers to create a vaccine that would create the same antibodies in the population. So from one side, they're saying that just because you have antibodies, it doesn't matter. From the other side, they're saying, we're going to give you these antibodies, so in the form of a vaccine. And it's hard, even for people who are in the business like myself, it's very hard to understand how the same people can say the same thing. And they completely ignore any sort of a history that we've had with other coronaviruses and how immunity system with that works. They're completely ignoring all of that.
So they haven't been able to draw a good model from SARS, because SARS had a higher fatality rate, but it was much less efficient in terms of reinfection, as I understand it, or in terms of infection.
No, it was actually much higher infectious, but it also
gotcha. So it was,
had highest fatality.
Got it. But somehow we contained that, right? If it was super highly infectious, you would think that it would have spread like this has. What do you attribute the differences?
That was a much more efficient killer.
Right.
Once you kill the infected subjects, they're not going to be spreading anything.
Right. I understand.
That's what happened. If you remember, there was the medical conference in Toronto that became sort of a killing field for that virus. There was like 27 or 28 physicians in that conference at one hotel in Toronto, just passed away within a matter of weeks. And so that was a much more efficient killer.
Well, one more sort of epidemiological bug question, if you will, is there's been anecdotal reports or whatever that this thing is mutating or modifying in a way that makes it even more efficient on the infection side, but less deadly. Is there any truth in that, or what do you think? Because
I have not seen any data on that.
Okay.
One thing we know is that this is not as an efficient copier of its own RNA, this virus. It copies itself at a much, much lower rate than, say, the common cold even. I mean, common cold is 4x more in its copying capability. So every strand of RNA copies itself 8 times. This one only does it twice. So the chances of mutation happens during that copying process.
Does that mean our probability of getting an effective vaccine are higher then? That because it's not a constantly a moving target?
In those terms, but then the vaccine has to work.
Right.
And then the antibodies have to work. we're all hoping that based on previous knowledge, it does work. And I'm hopeful, that it does.
Well, that's way off topic with entrepreneurship, but definitely germane for the day. And I guess,
and if I can say one more thing,
please.
There's a problem with just focusing on one piece of data, and that's what worries me is the fact that we're just doing PCR testing now. That's
tell the audience what PCR testing.
So PCR testing actually looks for the RNA strand of the virus, and it's a laboratory technique, and it essentially replicates that RNA strand that comes from somewhere on the body, like some place that we think we have a virus load. Usually, it's like cheek swab or nasal swab, essentially, and that shows that if you have an active infection, the virus is present in your body. And PCR, but the problem with PCR testing is that it's not 100% accurate. There's a lot of false positives, and there's some false negatives in that process. And then there's a lot of opportunities for introducing human error in the process too, because it's not a blood draw. It's actually depending on how far does the device go up the person's nose before they can collect enough of a virus load to be able to test. So there's a lot of junk data that is produced in mass testing using PCR, and without it doing a companion antibody test, which shows you what percentage of your population was infected to that point, we're going to get some wrong data introduced in there. Now, I haven't studied public health, but I'm a data guy, and I got into biotech through genomics, which is very data heavy portion of biotech. And what I'm afraid of is that we're going to have all of these poorly performed PCR tests that are going to show infections in people who are not truly infected. And then those people somewhere down the road are going to actually catch the virus. And then we're going to have this, the alarm that, oh my God, people who had it a month ago are already getting it again. They're getting reinfected. And that would just completely destroy the economy, because everyone's going to shut down as a result of that. Because if there's no immunity that comes from actually having the disease, then you're in big trouble. So even the vaccines won't work at that point. But if you had done the antibody test on that same person, you would know that, wait a second, there is no antibodies present at all. This person probably was not sick with this disease. Maybe they had the flu, maybe they had something else.
Interesting. I mean, it's definitely a complicated and complex issue. Would you be in the camp at this point of saying we protect those people that are most vulnerable, that have pre-existing conditions, that are elderly, and we just proceed with reopening the economy and the schools, and you take best prevention possible, and you manage your hospitalization, your ICU? I mean, it doesn't seem like we can really retrench to a complete shutdown, given the other health and economic woes that causes. What's your take on that?
Again, layman's studies of what's out there. I'm looking at like a Japanese model. I mean, you look at Japan, they never had a shutdown, but they did exactly that. They protected, and they have a much, much older population even than we do, even than Italy. Mm-hmm. I think they're the first or second oldest population in the world, the Japanese. And they live in cities Tokyo has a population of 18 million. And it's much, much denser than New York City, for example. But they manage not to have as many deaths and very low death rate, even to this day. And that's the way they did it, exactly as that. They protected the vulnerable population, but they did not, they cleaned and they didn't destroy the economy.
Interesting. Matthew, I know, is queued up with questions. I've probably stolen a bunch of his thunder here, but it's been a while since you and I have been able to catch up, Omid, so I always enjoy
likewise,
picking your brain.
No, you got some really good questions, Jeff. First, to start off, I really appreciate the work that you're doing. My mom actually had breast cancer a while back, and she's doing fine now, and she's actually a nurse practitioner in oncology, so she can help out people who actually went through the same stuff that she did. And she actually listens to the podcast, so hey, Mom.
Hello.
Something I was curious about, though, is when COVID started to become a big thing, how did your day-to-day operations change?
it was pandemic, so it felt like a state of emergency. So we worked 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours for a period of 5 weeks. And we went essentially from a company that does omics, proteomics and genomics, to learn how to do virology. What it takes. I mean, we essentially, our lab was built, but it wasn't ready for patient testing. So in those 5 weeks that we were validating a test in a completely new area of science, we actually got accreditation and certification for our laboratory as a high complexity laboratory to be able to run these samples in-house. So it was very busy, very little time off during those 5 weeks, but it also, there was a sense of mission in the company too, which was different than the methodical work that we usually do, trying to validate a test, make sure we don't make any mistakes, running clinical trials, waiting for patient samples to come in, collating data and all that, which is sort of a methodical, slower pace than this. This was, all hands to battle stations, do whatever you can to get things done. So exciting and sleepless at the same time.
Yeah, what was going through your mind at that time? Like, you had the grit and tenacity to take on the situation, and you had such a big impact on the area. I mean, what was really running through your mind at that time?
Well, we were hearing from people. We were hearing from people in large companies, especially food processing, which is sort of like a big business around us here, and how they have to stay open to make sure that the country is fed, but at the same time, their working conditions in their factories are in a way that maximizes the chance of people getting infected. And people were asking for solutions. Everyone's asking for solutions. So it was it felt very cooperative with everyone. With government, with healthcare workers, with laboratory workers, with other companies, places that we were sourcing things on. The people that make our laboratory equipment, Hamilton, they gave us first priority because we were working on COVID. So we had a field engineer here reprogramming our robots to get us ready. Now that we want to go back to breast cancer, we're back in line now to get our programming done for breast cancer.
You did mention that you are getting back into the breast cancer testing now that the clinics are opening back up. Moving forward, what percentage do you think Namida Labs, will be doing breast cancer versus antibody test, or moving in more so into that area of testing?
So we're going to do it in parallel because we essentially run 2 different laboratories here. They're side by side, but they're 2 different functions. One of them is the R&D lab, and R&D lab is going to switch now to breast cancer. So the validation work is going to be done in the R&D lab. The CLIA lab, sort of like our clinical laboratory, that's going to continue doing COVID testing. And it's a high throughput system. We can do 3,000 tests a day in one shift. So it's not, we're not hurting for capacity. We can actually switch between the 2 at any point. But the test validation work, we're not offering, the breast cancer is not a product yet. It has to be validated. And that validation is going to take between now and the end of the year.
From your perspective, what are some actions the government could have took to prevent what's happening right now?
Oh, I think that the fact that that the first stab at making a test, a PCR test, now this is the very beginning. If you remember, the PCR test development was handed over to CDC, and they failed at it. And that's when the private industry was brought in. I think that they should have they should have just opened up the data, given the RNA sequence to everybody, so private companies could do it. We're a small company compared to a company like Roche, a multi-billion-dollar behemoth. And look what we did in 5 weeks. And so we would have been a month ahead of everyone else. They essentially did not develop a good test. And testing really didn't pick up until the federal government opened it up to private industry.
That's where the power of innovation and entrepreneurship, there's strength in numbers, and there's strength in just having people who do this as a matter of course and are driven to more rapid time to market, and have some sort of fiscal discipline around it. It seems like governments should stick to oversight and regulatory approval that makes sense and streamlining, and not get in the business of trying to actually create something useful.
Yeah, early on, I proposed an op-ed to Wall Street Journal. They never published it, but we sort of got down the road with them. And it was a tongue-in-cheek sort of talking about the minor miracle that took place in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the pandemic. That, first of all, everyone started paying attention to diagnostics all of a sudden. Because diagnostics it's not quite the redheaded stepchild of the healthcare industry in the U.S. It's the incontinent three-legged puppy of that redheaded child. So 99% of spoils in biotech in the U.S. goes to pharma, and like 1% goes to diagnostics. But everyone wanted testing done at that point. And then FDA was approving tests in less time than it takes to fill out the paperwork. I mean, it takes less than 2 weeks. It takes longer than 2 weeks to fill out paperwork for approval at the FDA. And these guys were approving things in 2 weeks. And then CMS was approving paying for testing in less time than it takes to drive from FDA in DC to CMS in Baltimore. So these were all miracles that took place.
And that's completely antithetical to the way they operate. I mean, I mean, typically government never lets common sense or good practice get in the way with policy or regulation.
No. At least not in this area, they don't.
Right.
They believe in paralysis by analysis.
Right.
And so they are, so these were miracles that were taking place.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, it is pretty incredible. And it in some ways, and there's lots of good opportunities for criticism about how everything has gone down. There'll be lots of good postmortem lessons learned from all of this, I think. But the fact that they were able to have that sense of urgency and really react is a good thing. It was almost a World War II type of footing again in many respects and still is, in terms of the responsiveness and actually doing things that made sense because people were going to die if they didn't. So it'll be encouraging to see how much of this we learn from that we can really apply to be the ordinary course of business rather than just falling back into, well, this always takes 10 years to get anything worthwhile to market, and we're okay with that. It'd be nice.
The logic that they use is that we're trying to protect the public, right?
Sure.
That's why it takes $150 million and 10 years to bring a new diagnostic to market. Why? Why should it take 10 years? I mean, they've approved a lot of tests in 2 weeks. And what happened was that the market weeded out the bad ones right away.
Right.
I mean, they weren't in the market even for like 4 weeks before a study out of UCSF came out that showed a whole bunch of tests coming from China were garbage. And those were removed promptly from the market. Nobody used them again. There was no need for FDA to do anything at that point. So there's, I hope there are lessons learned. If there's another lesson to be learned, I hope they take that, but I doubt it that they will, is that these government agencies that have such important missions, like the CDC, they need to become a lot smaller and they need to be focused on what they can do best.
Right.
CDC shouldn't be worried about smoking or obesity or global warming. They should be worried about viruses and germs.
Absolutely. Stuff that is acute and that is not a lifestyle choice or some geopolitical issue that they have no control over. Makes worlds of sense. And since you mentioned China, not that we ever get into anything that's geopolitically charged on this one, but based on everything you've seen, everything you've heard, and your just knowledge of the area, was this lab created and accidentally spread into the local population? I'm not saying it's a bioweapon, but what's your conspiracy theory on how the virus was actually created and released?
I mean, I get my conspiracy theories from Henry Miller down at the Hoover Institution. He used to work at the FDA, and he is a virologist. He thinks it's not lab created, but he thinks that the bat or pangolin thing is just he doesn't think that actually happened. He thinks it was probably work that was being done at the lab.
They were doing research and it got away from them.
Through sloppy work, it just got, they have.
That's where I put my money. And then and I would say, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, that the geopolitical criminal part of this is their response to it. The lack of transparency and the cover up and just not saying anything in December when they could tell that it was about to hit the fan. I don't think it was one of these things of they wanted to tank the global economy and become the pariah of the world. I just can't see rational people in the CCP who are all about long-term maintaining their position thinking that was a good strategy. I think this was an accident that they tried to cover up and did a really crap job of talking to everybody about what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly, it's interesting that they sent a general from Beijing to take charge down in Wuhan, and he ordered everything destroyed, all samples destroyed. So had they not destroyed those samples, we would have had the sequence of this thing much sooner than later. We could have developed a test for it much faster. So there's a lot of dirty hands in the way it was handled. Like, for example, they stopped domestic travel from Wuhan, but they allowed international travel to continue.
And that's one where you think, well, maybe they were thinking, well, geez, let's spread the love and make it look like it wasn't really our problem.
You can make that argument, but what is that famous saying that why think bad intent when incompetence and just sheer stupidity will suffice?
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of times when people bring up these conspiracy theories, the government did this or the government did that, and if you've spent any time in and around and working with government, they're just not that good. They're not that good. None of them anywhere on the planet are that good. And so a lot of times this is like, major screw ups, and then they just want to maintain power and save face. And so they figure out how to get into the CYA game in a way that is going to reduce the damage. And it always ends up worse than if there was just transparency. And that's not a comment that is unique to totalitarian regimes like China and elsewhere. They just appear to be particularly oriented towards saving face and maintaining power more than most, because there's no election cycle that matters. So anyway, interesting. Well, I appreciate your insights on that. It has little to do with entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship, but it's just one of those things that occasionally the bunny trail I like to go down.
It's something we're all going through. So.
Exactly. Guys, get us back on track here. Now that we were now on the target list for the leaders of China.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna get hacked now. Podcast. It's probably about time to land the plane. And one question that we like to ask all of our guests as we land the plane, Omid, is if you had the opportunity to go back in time in a time machine and opportunity to speak to your younger self and give yourself some advice, what advice would you give your younger self?
Okay, so my first big job interview, how they you interview with people and every interview sort of is on the higher on the corporate chain. It was a senior VP at Kodak that I interviewed with, and he looked at my resume and he's like, "Oh, that's good. You've had publication. That's good. Good grades. That's good. This and that." And he's like, he turns and fixes his gaze and says, but it's better to be lucky than good. So I thought I'm never going to get that job at that point. But I got lucky and I got the job. And I don't deny that it's not easy, because when you work in a large company like Intel, you pick up the phone and you say you're calling from Intel. Everyone picks up the phone on the other side and wants to talk to you. But once you're on your own and just having to work to a point that people will take your call, that's an uphill battle. That's an uphill battle, and takes a lot. Takes a lot. So to my younger self, it would have been, stay lucky.
That's great. And if they want to, if the listeners want to find out more about all the great stuff you're doing, where's the best place they can find out more about Namida Labs?
Our website, and it's www.namidalab, all one word, .com.
Perfect.
Namida lab.com. By the way, I should tell, just so Namida is tears in Japanese, by the way.
Oh, very cool. All right. Excellent. So it ties back.
So Namida Bashi was, still is to this day. The bridge is still there, but Namida Bashi is the bridge of tears that used to link the jail in Tokyo to the execution grounds. And the bridge was where the condemned men and women were allowed to meet with their family. So that's metaphor for cancer, and we're trying to get rid of that.
Wow, that's one of the more meaningful brand stories and name that I've heard, I have to say. That's great. Really good. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Hopefully we can do one of these face-to-face.
Would love it. We're looking forward to the post-pandemic world and getting back to more beer drinking, which is really the whole reason why we started this podcast to begin with.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Omid. We'll see you. Take care. You bet.
Thank you, man.
Bye now.
Take care.